Let me move to Councilman Burton from Indiana.
Mr. Paulson, there are those of us that don't agree with your analysis that going about solving this problem was the correct way. You know, if you look at you talk about a meltdown, we have 9.5% unemployment right now. If you take into consideration those who are working part-time or who are getting unemployment compensation, it's closer to 16.5%. There was an article in the Wall Street Journal. So you're talking about how you guys saved the economy and saved the world. We do have a meltdown going on right now, and if you don't believe it, go out to Indiana and look at some of the parts of my district. Let me just ask you a couple of questions. First of all, I asked Mr. Bernanke if he talked to you about telling Mr. Lewis if they used the MAC clause that they were going to be fired. And he said he didn't give you any instruction or say anything to you about that. And yet when you spoke, you said that in your testimony, you said you were confident that that was a strong opinion of the Federal Reserve. How did you know that? I mean, there must have been some communication. How did you know? I mean, that you were confident that was their position?
I would say two things there. First of all, you're right that I do not remember Ben Bernanke ever suggesting to me that the Fed...
You don't remember. You know, Mr. Bernanke said the same thing. He said he didn't remember.
But what I do, so you ask where I came away with that view.
Yeah.
And I participated in a number of meetings and calls where Chairman Bernanke participated. There were lawyers from the Fed, staff members from the Fed, people from Treasury, and I came away from those calls with that understanding.
Well, wait. Well, if you came away from that, from those phone calls... No, listen, just a second. If you came away from that, from those phone calls, somebody must have said, hey, we can't let them do this.
Well,
and I would suggest that it might have been Mr. Bernanke.
Well, what I would say to you, I do not know whether someone in those conversations or calls expressly said it, or if my understanding came from just the tone and the forcefulness.
You know, you're a very smart man. I don't think anybody's buying what you're saying right now. I mean, you guys were on a phone call. There was a number of conversations and emails, and you're saying that you didn't get any suggestion from Mr. Bernanke that he wanted you to let them know they were going to be fired if they didn't do what you said?
I said I clearly came away with the understanding that this committee has, and which was substantiated by the emails that have been released and some of the other things, that was the view of the Fed. But I also don't remember Ben Bernanke ever talking about that possibility with me.
It's interesting that both you and Mr. Bernanke can't remember. Let me just read something here that really concerns me. First of all, they expected a $9 billion liability. And a few days later, they found out it wasn't $9 billion, but $12 billion. And so they were very concerned that they weren't going to be able to swallow all of that, and that's why they said they wanted to change this and use the MAC provision. And you didn't want to make that public. You didn't want to make any of this public. Why not?
Well, let me say to you that that is not a fact. This came up in connection with Ken Lewis asking me for a letter from Treasury. And what I said to him about a letter from Treasury is I said, Ken, we do not have any kind of a specific agreement here. We haven't decided on the size of the program, the dollar amount. We haven't decided on how many assets. And so if I gave a letter, all I would be saying is what I've already said publicly, which is that B of A is systemically important and that we are committed to, not having a failure.
Yeah,
so let me just finish here.
Don't use up all my time.
So what I said was just the opposite. I said if we give you a letter,
Mr. Paulson,
we'll disclose it.
Mr. Paulson, please pull the mic closer to you.
Oh, sorry. If we give you a letter, we will disclose it, was what I said.
Here's what was said in testimony. Bernanke and Paulson insisted that Lewis rely solely on their verbal assurance of more support because, as Paulson told Lewis in a written pledge, quote, would be a disclosable event, and we do not want a disclosable event.
Well,
and he goes into more detail than that.
Well, let me say Lewis has testified clearly before this committee that I never, ever suggested to him that he delay any disclosure. What I said to him was something I would expect you all would agree with, which is if we're going to issue a letter from the Treasury, I'm not going to issue a letter without disclosing that letter. And I don't see the point of a letter because we have no specific agreement. There's nothing to write down. We don't have the size of the program. We don't have the dollar amount. And we've already publicly said...
You gave him verbal assurance, but you wouldn't put it in writing.
I gave him verbal assurance that we were committed to working to get something done.
Why didn't you want to put it in writing? I mean, there's several places where he says that you would not allow it to be put in writing. You didn't want people to know. You didn't want public disclosure. Why not?
Well, because I attempted to answer. I'll answer it one more time for you, sir. What I had already said...
Mr. Chairman, will you ask the witness again to speak in the microphone? I can't hear.
Mr. Paulson.
I'm sorry. I had already said publicly, as had the Fed, that we were committed to working to prevent the failure of any systemically important institution, and Bank of America was one. Now, going beyond that, we had made it clear that we were going to be working with him to develop a support program, but we didn't have a size. We didn't have the amount of assets that would be covered. We didn't know what form of equity and how much. We had nothing definitive to say. And so I said, I don't see how a letter is going to be meaningful or helpful, but if I give you a letter, we're going to disclose it. And then that got twisted around to say I didn't want a disclosure.
I know my time's up. Let me just read one thing real quick, Mr. Chairman. Here's what he said. I was instructed that, quote, we do not want a public disclosure. That's what he said, flat out.
Well, he has testified something different before this committee.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Chairman,
I'm sorry, his time has expired.
I have a procedural question. That Mr. Paulson clearly is moving back and forth. Is there enough slack in the mic? The mic could be pulled more to the edge of the table.
Yeah, here we go. I got it.
If you pull it back that direction later on.
Thanks.
Thank you very, very much. We haven't, Mr.